Over the last 20 years, cities around the world have seen the emergence of different types of nocturnal governance apparatuses like night mayors, night czars, nightlife liaison officers, night councils. For a lot of us, the role of these people or institution is not clear. Are they there to police the night, or are they industry affiliated people willing to push forward corporate developments of the night? Here with us now is Andreina Seijas, a Venezuelan researcher and international consultant specializing in nocturnal governance and planning. She is currently a research fellow at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Hi, Andreina.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so
Good,
much
you?
for coming.
Well, thanks for joining us today. So what exactly is nocturnal governance, and where does the concept come from?
Yeah, so nocturnal governance or nighttime governance refers to the set of institutions, mechanisms, laws, and different elements that cities have to govern what happens at night. And it's interesting to see that while the idea of nighttime governance is becoming more prominent in recent years, this has existed. Cities have, throughout the years, historically always had mechanisms to govern what happens at night. And it's interesting to see, for instance, how when you dig into the history and you look at the role of night watches or how institutions such as the police emerged over time, it's really interesting how these institutions are not static and they evolve. And something that I've been seeing through my research is how when it comes to the night, there's a growing cast of actors involved in managing nighttime activities. So the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, the police, as I was saying before, but there's other actors in other kinds of institutions, both state and non-state institutions that have become involved. For instance, business improvement districts have been proliferating in North America, in the UK, in Europe since the 1990s. And business improvement districts, or BIDs, are a very important mechanisms that cities have to devolve part of that power, part of that authority to do enhancements in safety, in lighting, in different activities that have a great impact over night environments. Also, another actor is square hosts or brigades of patrolling brigades that different cities have implemented to mediate between those who go out at night and those who want to sleep. For instance, in Paris, there's the Pierrot de la Nuit, or in Amsterdam, you have the red-jacketed square hosts. You have different forms of mediators that are deployed at night, and most of them are usually they're volunteers. And then you have a later actor, a more recent actor, which is the night mayors or night managers or night czars, which are individuals that are positions created by cities or within cities to mediate between people from the nightlife industry, the local governments, and the residents who live in the city.
You were referring to state institutions and non-state organizations. What's the difference between these? Is there one that's better than the other, or how can we compare this? Because I know some night mayors started off as activists and ended up being state employees. So how can we see this?
Yeah, so I wouldn't like to talk about what's better or what's worse, in the sense that I think we still need tons of more empirical data to make those claims. The study, last year we produced, and I say we because I did this study along with my colleague Mirek Milan Gelders, the former night mayor of Amsterdam. We decided to try to look at these questions from an empirical and a data-driven perspective. So we said, okay, how much do we know about this movement? Because we call it a movement in the sense that when you look at a map of the world and how many cities have created these positions, it's been exponential, not only in terms of space, but also in terms of time. Historically, their role is propagating very fast. So we said, okay, so how can we get information about these roles, understand their variations, and understand what kind of impact they're having? So we did this study. It's a mostly descriptive study that provides typology of night mayors, but I believe that we still need more information to be able to really gauge what's the impact of these institutions, because they're so different from each other that we can't claim if one is better than the other. But to your question, there's two main types, I would say. I would say that you can either think about those night mayors or nighttime advocates that are independent champions at city level. When I say city level, they're situated within a city, but outside of city government. And then the second type is those night mayors, night stars, and managers that are situated within City Hall. And even within that type, you have many options. Some night mayors can be situated under the departments of safety. Some of them are situated under the departments of culture or tourism or local economic development. The majority of them are situated under the departments of culture and tourism. But you can see there's many options. And each of these options entails a different variety of resources and access and levels of authority that these figures have. So it's really important to understand that while there's this basic element that all night mayors have in common, which is being these mediators between these parties, but within that definition, there's all kinds of variations. So it's very difficult to say the impact they've been having is good or bad, because we still need more information. So I hope that this study, like the one we did with Merrick last year, I hope it will spark more interest by academics, by policymakers, and by other professionals to conduct more studies and to, gain more information about this emerging field.
Are we able to date back the concept of the modern night governance idea? Is there like one of the first examples in history that you would say that the first night mayor, or is there like examples before that of maybe organizations that were interested in the night?
Yes, well, when you look at the type of mediators, as I was saying before, I would say that the first organization in this trajectory was the Club Commission in Berlin, because they were the first ones to emerge in 2001. And then in 2003, that's when the first night mayor emerged in Amsterdam. And in the beginning, the night mayor in Amsterdam wasn't just one person. It was a group of people working and advocating for the night. And it's interesting to see how even within one city, which is Amsterdam, the role has evolved a lot. It started with a group of people, then it became one person. It started focusing mostly on nightlife, then it expanded its scope to focus also on creative matters. And nowadays, the role is getting even bigger. They just announced this week that the city will grant a new set of 24-hour licenses or permits. And the Night Mayor Foundation has been very, very involved in that process, not only helping identify which are the best places in Amsterdam to locate these venues that will have which venues should get licensed, but also in monitoring the rollout of the program, which is a temporary license that lasts up to 3-4 years. So I would say that when you look back, we can look to Berlin and Amsterdam as a foundational cities of this movement. And in the study that we produced, you can download, there's a whole timeline. It's really interesting because the years in which the greatest number of night mayors or positions were created were 2018 and 2019. In those years, at least 10 different positions respectively were created. So it's really interesting how it's been an exponential growth in the movement.
So it's a very new field of interest in a way within cities. But if we often relate nighttime governance to the night studies in the university field, is that like, is that a new thing too? I mean, I think there's very few people, I think, who talk about these topics now. So.
Yeah, so the field of night studies is really interesting. And I think, well, Will Straw can probably tell you more about this because he's an expert on how the field of night studies emerged. But it's really interesting to see how the field of night studies has evolved very much in connection to culture and urban revitalization. So in the 1990s, post-industrial cities had to rethink the way they operated, and they had to shift from production, since they were no longer production sites, to become consumption sites. And in that transition, that's where the concept of the nighttime economy and the concept of the night, of the 24-hour city emerged. And it's interesting to see how this field started from culture and from urban revitalization, but nowadays what we're trying to do, at least from my own work, is to connect this field of the urban night to urban planning. So I've been trying to, through my work here at Harvard University, at the School of Design, I've been trying to apply different methods that we use, that planners, urban planners use, such as using geospatial analysis, GIS, and different planning methods to apply them to the study of the night. Because I believe that the night is an emerging field, and for an emerging field to consolidate and to become, you know, a long-lasting and influential field of research and practice, we need a more data-driven approach. So I believe in using using different mechanisms to gather information systematically about the field, and as I said, mapping or even using qualitative methods, as the one we used in the study, to get a better sense of where this is going and how it shapes how these institutions of governance not only shape the way we live in cities from a political perspective, but also how they shape, I like to talk about the hardware and the software of the city. The hardware or the infrastructure, the built environment of the city, and the software or the regulations. For instance, many of these night mayors and institutions are getting involved in topics such as nighttime transport. Nighttime transportation such as the night tube in London, or pilots for transport that have existed in cities like Mexico City. So the idea is that how can night mayors and nighttime institutions also have an impact over elements in the built environment of the city and also in the regulations. And we see that the night is a very interesting field, but also a very fragile and vulnerable field. And it tends to happen that in the context of a crisis, things change very dramatically. And I call it the pendulum effect. There's like a pendulum effect. You go from one extreme to the other, and that also has to do with who the mayor is and what's a political tendency that the mayor has. And we can think about many examples of curfews and very strict regulations that have been imposed in different parts of the world as a result of, let's say, a violent incident. I can think about right now the lockout laws in Sydney, which started, I believe, in 2014, and they were the product of a couple of very violent deaths of young people in Sydney's central business district. After that happened, it's the typical pendulum effect. You go from a city that is a global city, a very open city, to imposing a curfew that then had an impact on the vibrancy of the CBD. And now many studies have been conducted, but they have been conducted after the fact, after imposing the measure. And they've realized that having a lockdown and having a curfew in a city such as Sydney has more negative effects than the positive effects that they were intended to. So now they're repealing that law. They're repealing those laws. They have been removed from the CBD. They're still in place in other parts of the city. But it's interesting to see how, in context of a crisis, and I'm talking about this because we can then connect maybe to what's happening today, but when something unexpected happens, nighttime activity always suffers. And it's because when something unexpected happens, when there's a death, when there's a terrorist attack, and we've seen how clubs and night music venues have been targets of terrorism in many parts of the world, in the US, in France. And when these things happen, then we were talking before, there's a broadcast of actors, but suddenly the police comes to the front again. Suddenly it's the police who has to take care of everything. And the other actors that are around the police they get diluted. So it's interesting to see that this pendulum effect keeps happening, and it leads to very reactive measures, like a curfew. The government says, everyone goes home, and this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna restrict the activity, the possibilities of movement that you have at night. What I'm trying to advocate through this data-driven approach is a proactive version or of a proactive vision of the night that tries to avoid these reactive pendulum-like responses from the government, so that we can ensure a more stable and a more formalized field for the years to come.
You mentioned the Australian lockdown. Let's talk about the elephant in the room and the global lockdown we've just been through, and the COVID-19 crisis we're going through this summer.
Yes.
So I'd like to ask you like a very simple question, but I think you already touched the topic a little bit. But why is night culture always the first victim in these crises? And how has it harmed the nighttime activities, the crisis we're going through right now? I think in many ways we talk about that the virus has assassinated night culture and nighttime activities, and we've seen a lot of pushback against these activities. Curfews have been put in place in certain cities, so-called Cinderella laws, where closing time for bars have been cut short to midnight. Bars are now seen as super vectors of the virus. What does this tell us? So where do we draw the line between a sound advice for the safety of all and just straight up stigmatization again of the night? After all, the virus does not wake up when the sun sets.
Yes, so it's important to know that even before the virus started, before this pandemic got started, already nightlife industries and creative industries were vulnerable, particularly nightlife. And the reasons for this vulnerability were, as I was saying before, well, first, it's a very highly disregarded field from many perspectives. Also, it's a field with low profit margins. However, it's been growing very fast in countries like the US after the and in Europe after the recession. Nightlife and restaurants have been booming. And also, it's important to know that they've been vulnerable in the sense that for instance, when you think about music, many music venues have been operating for years as a restaurant or as something else, because the categories, from a planning perspective, the categories under which these types of establishments operate are invisible. So they have to, tweak the rules and adapt, and they have to navigate a very intricate network of regulations that is not easy for anyone. On top of that, and on top of the existing pressures such as growing online retail and all other things that we know, boom, there's a crisis. And that now, and the nature of this crisis it's what's most important here, because it's the type of crisis that it's hitting a very important element, the essence of nightlife and entertainment, which is socializing. So if your biggest enemy is agglomerations, then what can you do? How can you socialize? So I think it's forced. It's forced. Force is a very strong word, but I think it's encouraged us very strongly to pause, take a step back, and start rethinking many things. On one hand, I believe it's a great opportunity, but the crisis we're living right now, it's devastating. It's been very, very sad, all the losses of employment, of opportunities, of businesses, and the vibrancy that we'll see for many years. But still, I think it's an opportunity to rethink many things that were not okay before the crisis, and that definitely should be fixed. But we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful of not speculate too much, and really base our proposals and base our plans on, as I said, data and on experiments. And I believe in experimentation, and I believe that something great that can be done to rethink about this crisis, or rethink the responses to this crisis, is to think about time in a different way. As you were saying, these Cinderella laws and these curfews, there's a mixture of things right now in the air. In the air, aside from the virus, but that is in the air, there's many things up in the air in terms of regulations and very, very too much uncertainty, since we don't have a vaccine. While we don't have that, probably many governments will not be willing to be very flexible with the regulations, but they should. And the reason why they should is because this particular needs of social distancing require more space. And we've seen how all kinds of restaurants, of cafes, of bars all over the world, in cities all over the world, are now using space in a different way. We see tables placed in sidewalks. We see streets that are closed for pedestrians. We see people are biking more. We see people are walking more. And we see how these walls between private and public space are becoming more permeable. And there's a greater interaction, which is something great that it would be great to prevail in our cities. But beyond space, beyond trying to make these restaurants, use more space in the street, we should also think about time. Time is a very important variable here too. And imagine if you could stagger different activities in the city and use time as a way to achieve social distancing. So, and this is something that is not new. There's been all kinds of pilots and experiments around the use of time for many, many years. There's from conversations about off-peak hours and how certain deliveries and logistical activities in cities should take place in off-peak hours so they don't interfere with the mobility of the majority of the population, to companies like Microsoft trying to change their whole, schedule so people are more productive, to the idea of the 24-hour city. And the idea of the 24-hour city is a great platform to encourage governments to test and experiment. And by this I mean, imagine if we did some sort of analysis in a neighborhood, in a city, or in a set of neighborhoods. We measured several indicators, and we came up with what's the best place to start a pilot in which we allowed businesses in that area to stay open later, but significantly later, and to create a new set of time frames for businesses to operate. As I said, this could be experiments, or this could be pilots that can be tested, always backed by data and always backed by feasibility studies. But I do believe that time will present a new avenue for experimentation and change and innovation in the context of this crisis that requires more distancing from each other.
Well, we've seen a lot of cities doing these types of experiments, but maybe not about nighttime. Like I know here in Montreal, they've suddenly decided to close a lot of streets to cars and make them pedestrian, and give restaurants bigger patios to accommodate more people, since their capacity has been cut down. But there seems to be people say city seems to be a bit shy to try and experiment with the night, and I know here in Montreal, they just announced that bars must close now at midnight because of the virus. We only had like one weekend and it didn't go so well for some places. So by enforcing this prohibition of the night, we've seen the rise of illegal raves and events and parties almost everywhere around the world. But so this makes me think, should we consider nighttime socialization activities as a type of essential service in a way, especially coming out of 3 months of confinement and lockdown? People have been stuck in their apartments, and I think it's had like this huge impacts on individual mental health. We haven't been able to see our friends, to meet strangers, and I think we've come up with the understanding now that maybe this plays a very essential role in human life.
Definitely. You just hit on something that is very, very important, which is the importance of socialization, particularly at night, from a social perspective. This idea is what got me started in this field. Actually, I come from my hometown is Caracas, Venezuela. And Caracas is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. It has been for a long time. And what got me started in this field in studying the night was that I realized that in a highly dangerous and highly polarized environment, such as the one that I grew up in, the night becomes something that is out of reach. It becomes something that is forbidden. You can't go out at night because it's dangerous. You can't go out at night because it becomes an exclusive space that you fear. And I realized that was having, and that is having, a very negative impact over younger generations in my country, because when you grow up and when you don't have access to others in public spaces, and when you don't have access for that socialization at night, then you miss opportunities to form identities, to know others, for social capital. And bringing that to the Corona crisis, I believe that this crisis has demonstrated many, many things, and I think we have to pay attention to the way people are behaving. It tends to happen that we set up the rules and we expect people to follow them, but we should do the other thing. We should do the other thing the other way around. We should also pay attention to the way people behave, and then try to adapt part of those rules. Because the way people behave in cities is very dynamic, and preferences change and patterns change, and we need to pay close attention to that. And this is all to say that we are aware that socializing is very important. And we know that doesn't matter if we have the Cinderella laws or the curfews, people will still need to meet each other. So there's all kinds of discussions. This is a very broad debate. There's more restrictive approaches that say that we need to provide very clear guidelines for people to socialize. Otherwise, it's going to get out of control, and that's more from the public health perspective. But there's also another type of arguments that suggest that if they're going to go out anyway, then let's just organize the mess. I mean, if they're going to go out and they're going to do raves and they're going to do festivals and they're going to, be outdoors, then let's just provide basic ideas and basic mediation to avoid conflict or problems from escalating. So
it's a harm reduction approach.
It's a harm reduction approach, definitely. So I believe that we should find middle ground. We should find ways in which we can, adopt a harm reduction approach, always by validating these ideas with public health experts. As you know, I'm part of this global nighttime recovery plan with many people around the world, and we're trying to answer many questions right now, huge questions like what's the future of dance floors and what's the future of open air nightlife. And one of the things we're seeing, and that you will see in one of the first chapters of this plan that is coming up very soon, is this different tensions that exist between this harm reduction approach and this very restrictive approach. And you will see examples, very concrete examples of cities that are using these approaches. So then again, I think it's important to pay attention of what's happening out there. And I think one important lesson that has come to me from this whole crisis is that now more than ever we can learn from each other. I think it has created many opportunities for collaboration and for shared knowledge. And I think it's very important that we all, through spaces like this one, that we are able to share more information and to learn from each other.
Before we conclude this conversation, I'd like to ask you to give us maybe a little scoop. I'm wondering, because you're so connected with different cities around the world and different nighttime ambassadors, what type of socialization activities at night have local governments around the world maybe put in place this summer to replace the loss of venues and clubs and ensure a safe and secure event? Do you have like a inspiring, positive examples you can think of that very, very innovative cities around the world have put in place? What can drive us, to design new ideas, new ways to occupy the night within, social distancing measures?
Wow, that's a very big question, and I believe that there's not a one size fits all response to these things. I do believe that unfortunately, one of the biggest challenges now is that we're all in very different phases. So phases of dealing with the crisis, and right now, as of today, some countries that had reopened now are back in lockdown, and some countries that were reopening and we're almost going to reach the phase where they were reopening their bars and restaurants, they had to pause because the cases started going up. So I think right now we have to be very responsible and we have to be very attentive to what's happening. And I would say we need to be observant of these behaviors that and these different dynamics that are happening. I believe that the solutions will not come from governments only. I believe that the solutions come from different actors coming together. The governments have a responsibility to protect their citizens, and they have a responsibility to ensure and to enforce these public health measures. But then there's other actors in society that have very bright ideas on how to diversify this, diversify the pools of resources and diversify the pool of actions. I would say my recommendation, I wouldn't like to pick one thing that is being innovative. I mean, there's many things happening right now. As I said, Amsterdam is launching more 24-hour licenses, which is great in terms of the perspective of time. New York has been very flexible and innovative with different policies and around the use of space. There's cities all over the world that have been conducting surveys to measure the impact of COVID-19 over their nighttime and creative industries. For instance, I just finished I'm working with the city of Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, and we just implemented a survey and we got more than 100 responses from people who work only in the city center at night. And we're learning, we're mapping how many of these businesses will reopen and how many probably won't, and trying to talk to the government and talk to different organizations to help fund responses and support for them. But this is all to say that I believe that these solutions will not be successful if they don't involve other parties, and that we have to keep measuring and keep track of these responses.
Well, thank you, Andreina. I think it's been a very inspiring conversation. I hope we can get out of this crisis as soon as possible and open the night back again, and I hope to catch you soon. Keep up the good work. We need people like you to mediate the interest of nighttime users and help us build concepts so we can address these questions with more meaningful concepts to our local authorities. So thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.